The gold didn't melt. Everything else did. The muscle, the soft tissue, the memories of 5 different lives, all reduced to a fine gray powder. But the dental bridge stayed. It was a small, shiny piece of metal glinting in the filth of a dirty white stove. One of the investigators reaches into the ash, his fingers trembling. He expects to find charcoal. Instead, he finds a human jaw fragment only a few millimeters thick. Then, the realization hits the room like a physical blow. Entering that kitchen was like stepping into hell. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of rancid fat and old smoke that is soaked into the wooden beams above. A single bare light bulb hangs from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling linoleum. In the corner stands the stove, massive, dirty white, with cracks in the plaster and a mouth choked with soot that never comes clean. This isn't just a kitchen, it's an incinerator. This was the home of Metod Trobec, a man whose name would come to represent the depths of human depravity, a man who, for years, lived among us in plain sight, hiding a monstrous secret. Trobec was a man of 2 faces, one of the most chilling aspects of his nature. By day, he was the model worker, a driver for the company Iskra, an occasional laborer, his hands large and rough, like tools worn by years of hard work. He was the kind of man who spoke little, but when he did, it was with the calm, assured manner of someone who knew how to manipulate, how to charm. He greeted the neighbors in his small village, but he never looked them in the eye. As one neighbor recalled, he always stared somewhere beyond you, as if he saw something behind your back. His eyes were glassy, blue-gray, dead, without shine. But when night fell, the mask slipped. By night, Trobec haunted the taverns of Ljubljana. These were the places where the forgotten and marginalized came, where the lonely souls gathered in the shadows, looking for warmth, looking for company. He was drawn to them, women who, like him, were seeking something they could never find. He was polite, even gallant, offering promises of warmth, protection, and a place to belong. He preyed on the vulnerable, the isolated. It wasn't hard to spot them. Vida Priatelli, Mariana Kankar, the young and insecure Urška Stravs, Anna Plevnik, and Zorka Sever. These women were drawn into his web with the same lies. Come with me, I'll take care of you. They would trust him, and they would disappear. Trobec's evil, however, didn't come from nowhere. His roots stretched deep into a dark and painful childhood. Born on June 6, 1948, in the small village of Planina near Horzul, he was an illegitimate child, a fact that carried a heavy social stigma in the conservative post-war Yugoslav countryside. He was raised by a mother who was strict, emotionally cold, and a religious fanatic. She would beat him frequently, using physical pain as a primary tool of discipline. The circumstances of his birth were further darkened by the death of his twin brother during delivery, a tragedy that left Metod with a subconscious sense of half-being, a sense of incompleteness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His adolescence was marked by isolation and burgeoning deviance. At the age of 14, he set fire to a neighbor's haystack, a classic early sign of the Macias triad of sociopathic development. A year later, he was caught stealing a moped. These weren't just teenage rebellions, they were the first tremors of a collapsing moral structure. After completing a short military service, he moved to Germany, working as a laborer. It was there that his internal darkness began to manifest in more specific, violent fantasies. He returned to Slovenia with a German car and a wardrobe of Western clothes, using this newfound success to mask the void within. His relationship with women, shaped by his mother's cold, abusive upbringing, was profoundly twisted. He saw them simultaneously as objects of desire and agents of humiliation. He was married twice. His first marriage to Stefka lasted only months before she fled, terrified by his explosive temper and physical abuse. His second marriage to Anna was no better. She described a man who could switch from charming to murderous in a heartbeat. In his mind, The only way to take back control was through violence, through power, through dominance. As a psychiatrist would later note, Trobec isn't insane in the classic sense. He simply chose the wrong because it brought him pleasure. His killings weren't about money, they weren't about theft, they were about something far darker. It was about the feeling of cleansing, of power, of destruction. The way he killed was intimate, strangulation by hand. There was no gun, no weapon, just his hands wrapped around their throats, feeling the life drain from them with every squeeze. It wasn't just death he wanted, it was control over life itself. He would later confess that he felt a sense of relief or calm after the life left their bodies. At his secluded farm in Dolenja Vas, house number 32, Trobec's sadistic nature found its perfect setting. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, far enough from the village that no one would hear the screams, but close enough that the smoke from his stove would betray him. The hallways of his home were dark and damp, lined with rough stone walls that seemed to absorb the sounds of his crimes. This was where he worked. It was in these hallways, where the shadows seemed to stretch forever, that he would dismember his victims. A chopping block sat against the wall, stained with blood, a silent witness to the horrors that had taken place there. The key to his twisted ritual was the stove. To destroy a body completely, he needed heat. But not just any heat. It had to be above 800 degrees Celsius to reduce the bones to ash. Firewood was piled high, but the real secret was the tires. Old car tires, which burned at an intensely high temperature, producing thick, toxic black smoke. The smoke masked the unmistakable smell of burning flesh, replaced by the pungent chemical stench of burning rubber. Neighbors noticed the smoke. They thought it was nothing more than trash burning, a common sight on remote farms. They never questioned why a man would burn tires in the middle of a warm summer night. The victims' stories are a catalogue of tragedy. Vida Priatelli vanished in March 1976. She was a hard-working woman whose disappearance was initially ignored by a police force that assumed she had simply left for work in Austria or Germany. Mariana Kankar, a mother of two, followed in May 1977. Then came Urška Stravs, only 23, an insecure girl who thought she had finally found a protector. Anna Plevnik and Zorka Sever were taken in 1978. In each case, the pattern was the same: a meeting in a tavern, a few drinks, a ride to the secluded farm, and a final terrifying struggle in the dark. When the bodies were reduced to ash, Trobec would perform his most chilling ritual. He would spread the remains across his vegetable garden. The victims literally became part of the earth that had sustained him. The ground that nourished the crops now nourished the remains of his victims. It was a grotesque cycle of life and death, one that only he understood. He grew vegetables in that soil, eating the products of a garden fertilized by human remains. For 2 years, between 1976 and 1978, Trobec killed approximately once every 6 months. His methodical, almost scientific approach made it difficult for the authorities to catch him. The police were operating in a pre-DNA era, and they were unprepared for a serial killer who was as systematic and patient as Trobec. They searched the garden initially, thinking the bodies were buried there in shallow graves, but they overlooked the stove. They never suspected that the remains of the victims were sitting right in front of them, in the ash, fused to the bricks of the furnace. It wasn't until May 30th, 1979, when Trobec made a fatal mistake, that the police finally had a breakthrough. He tried to rob a German tourist named Adolf Mesmer, luring him into the house under the guise of hospitality. But Mesmer was stronger and more alert than the women Trobec usually targeted. He managed to fight back, escape the house, and flag down a passing car. His report to the police was for attempted robbery and assault, not murder. However, when investigators arrived at Dolenja Vas 32 to execute a search warrant for the stolen items, the smell of the house and the erratic behavior of Trobec raised alarms. As they moved through the kitchen, one officer noticed the unusual amount of ash in the stove. He poked a stick into the debris and heard a metallic clink. It was the dental bridge of Anna Plevnik. The investigators then began a forensic sift of the entire stove. They found 163 bone fragments, some as small as a grain of sand. They found buttons, hairpins, and the remains of a prosthetic hip. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. The trial in 1980 was a national sensation, unlike anything ever seen in socialist Yugoslavia. The state-controlled media, usually silent on capitalist crimes like serial murder, couldn't ignore the monster of Dolenja Vas. The courtroom was packed every day. Trobec sat in the dock, often looking bored or agitated, occasionally smirking at the witnesses. He was defended by Milan Vujin, one of the most prominent lawyers of the era. Vujin knew his client was doomed, but he fought a technical battle. It is a piece of legal folklore in Slovenia that Vujin, unable to be paid by the impoverished Trobec, eventually took the iron door of the stove as a morbid form of payment, a memento mori for his own private collection. Trobec was sentenced to death on November 25, 1980. However, the sentence was later commuted to 20 years in prison, the maximum term under Slovenian law at the time. This sparked public outrage. People felt the law was too lenient for a man who had burned human beings like trash. While in prison at Dob, the most notorious correctional facility in the country, Trobec didn't seek redemption. He remained a predatory figure. In 1992, during a period of political transition in Slovenia, Trobec attacked a fellow inmate, Roman Velikonja, stabbing him repeatedly with a sharpened spoon. He claimed the man was looking at him wrong. This act of violence earned him an additional 15 years, ensuring he would never see freedom again. Even the prison guards were unsettled by him. He was known to spend hours staring at the walls of his cell, whispering to himself, or performing strange, repetitive exercises. His cell was a reflection of his mind, sterile, empty, devoid of any personal mementos, no photos of family, no letters from the outside world. He had erased his own identity just as he had attempted to erase the very existence of his victims. The psychological profile of Metod Trobec remains a centerpiece of Balkan criminology. He was a necro-sadist, a man who derived sexual and emotional gratification from the process of dying and the subsequent destruction of the corpse. He represented a rare bridge between the disorganized and organized killer profiles. He was impulsive enough to attack a tourist, yet methodical enough to dispose of 5 bodies without leaving a trace for years. In the end, it was Trobec who chose the time and manner of his death. On May 30th, 2006, exactly 27 years to the day after his initial arrest for the robbery that unmasked him, he took his own life. He had been transferred to a closed unit of the Dob prison. Using a bedsheet, he fashioned a noose and hanged himself from the bars of his cell. He left no suicide note, no final confession, and no apology to the families of the women he had incinerated. He died alone, his body unclaimed for days. His name, however, remained etched in the collective psyche. He became a boogeyman in Slovenian culture, a name parents would whisper to warn children about the dangers of the dark. The house in Dolenja Vas became a place of dark tourism, with people traveling from across the country to stand outside the gate and stare at the chimney that once exhaled the souls of 5 women. Metod Trobec was a man who, in the most chilling way possible, sought to erase those around him. He didn't just want them dead, he wanted them gone from the very fabric of reality, transformed into heat, smoke, and fertilizer. The horror he unleashed in those quiet, isolated places will never truly be cleaned away. The smell of burning rubber, the heavy air of the kitchen, and the shadows cast by that single flickering light bulb, these are the ghosts of Dolenja Vas. They serve as a permanent, grim reminder that sometimes the person living next door, the polite worker with the glassy eyes, is carrying a fire that can turn a home into a furnace and a neighbor into ash. The case of Trobec also forced a radical change in how missing persons were handled in the region. Before him, adult disappearances were often dismissed as voluntary departures or migration for work. After the stove was opened, the authorities realized that silence doesn't always mean a person has moved on. Sometimes it means they have been silenced forever. Today, the garden is overgrown with weeds. The house is a crumbling ruin, reclaimed by the damp forest of Dolenja Vas. But the legend of the man with the two faces remains, a shadow in the history of crime that refuses to fade. The gold didn't melt, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried in ash, always finds its way to the surface. Surface. Surface.